The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as James Mitchell took his position outside Buckingham Palace. His red uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, with every button gleaming in the early light. The tall bearskin hat sat firmly on his head, adding to his already impressive height. To the tourists gathering behind the iron gates, he was just another guard, another statue in fancy dress. Another photo opportunity for their vacation albums. A group of American teenagers approached first, phones already raised. They giggled as they posed next to him, making exaggerated saluting gestures and silly faces. James kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face an emotionless mask, just as he had been trained. His breathing remained steady and controlled, though inside, memories flickered like old film reels. "Do you think he's even real?" one of the girls asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. She waved her hand in front of his face. "Hello, anybody home?" Her friends erupted in laughter. An older man with a camera encouraged them. "Go on, see if you can make him smile. That's what they're here for, isn't it?" Entertainment. James remained perfectly still. His mind, however, drifted to a different time, a different place. Sand instead of cobblestones. The scorching heat of Afghanistan instead of London's mild autumn air. The weight of combat gear instead of ceremonial uniform. The chaos of battle instead of tourist chatter. A middle-aged woman in a bright yellow jacket stepped forward next. "I bet they don't even do anything real," she said to her husband. "Just stand there looking pretty for the tourists. Easiest job in the world, if you ask me." Her husband nodded in agreement. Probably failed at everything else and got stuck with this. I mean, who would actually choose to be a human statue? The comments continued throughout the morning. Some were merely ignorant, others were cruel. A businessman in an expensive suit made a joke about the guards being toy soldiers. A group of college students debated whether the guards were even real military or just actors hired for show. An elderly tourist complained that her tax money was wasted on useless pageantry. James heard every word. Each comment landed somewhere deep inside him, not with anger, but with a strange kind of sadness. These people had no idea. They couldn't know. How could they possibly understand what it took to stand where he was standing? The morning dragged on. More tourists arrived in waves, each group bringing their own assumptions and mockery. Some were harmless, just excited visitors caught up in the novelty. Others were deliberately disrespectful, trying to provoke a reaction. To get that perfect viral video for their social media accounts, a young man in a football jersey decided to test the boundaries. He stepped over the chain barrier, approaching within inches of James's face. "Oi, mate! Can you hear me? Bet you can't do anything, can you? Just gotta stand there and take it." His friends cheered him on, recording everything on their phones. Security guards nearby began moving toward the situation, but protocol required James to handle it first. Still, he didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the intrusion in any way. The young man grew bolder, making faces, doing a mocking impression of a military march. "My little brother could do this job," he announced proudly. Literally anyone could just stand still. Where's the skill in that? What the young man couldn't see, what none of them could see, were the scars hidden beneath James's uniform. The surgical scars on his left shoulder where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. The burn marks on his right arm from dragging a fellow soldier away from a burning vehicle. The psychological scars that ran even deeper, invisible but ever-present. James had been deployed 3 times. His first tour came straight out of training, barely 20 years old, full of pride and purpose. Afghanistan had seemed like an abstract concept, until the plane touched down and the reality of war became immediate and undeniable. The heat hit first, then the dust, then the constant awareness that danger could come from anywhere. At any moment, his unit had been stationed at a forward operating base in Helmand Province. The days blended together, filled with patrols, security checks, and the endless tension of waiting for something to happen. When action came, it came fast and brutal. The sound of gunfire became as familiar as breathing. The sight of blood, both enemy and friendly, became routine. During his second deployment, James had earned his first commendation for bravery. An improvised explosive device had detonated during a patrol, destroying the late vehicle and severely wounding 3 soldiers. While others had taken cover, James had run toward the burning wreckage. The heat had been intense, the smoke blinding, but he had pulled 2 men to safety before the ammunition stored in the vehicle began cooking off. The 3rd deployment had nearly been his last. His unit had been ambushed during a routine supply convoy. The attack came from 3 sides, coordinated and devastating. James had returned fire while organizing his squad's defensive position, directing them with the calm authority that came from experience. A rocket-propelled grenade had struck nearby, and the explosion had thrown him against a wall. He remembered the feeling of flying, the sudden silence after his ears stopped working, the confusion of trying to stand on legs that wouldn't cooperate. He had woken up 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany. The doctors had been amazed he survived. The physical therapy had taken months. The mental recovery had taken longer. The nightmares still came sometimes, though less frequently now, but standing here, in this courtyard wearing this uniform, was a choice. It was an honor. The Queen's Guard wasn't a consolation prize or a backup plan. It was one of the most prestigious positions in the British Army. The selection process was rigorous, demanding excellence in every aspect of military service. Physical fitness, mental fortitude, discipline, and a spotless record were all required. For every guard standing at their post, dozens of equally qualified soldiers had been turned away. James had applied for the position during his recovery. He had wanted to continue serving, but in a different capacity. The wounds from his last deployment had left him unable to return to active combat duty, but his dedication to military service remained unshaken. When the acceptance letter arrived, he had felt the same pride he had felt the day he first put on his uniform years ago. The training for ceremonial duties had been surprisingly challenging. Standing perfectly still for hours required a different kind of endurance than combat. The attention to detail in uniform presentation exceeded even the strictest field inspections. Learning the precise movements, the exact timing, the historical significance of every gesture had taken months of practice. Now, 3 months into his posting, James understood that this duty carried its own unique challenges. Combat tested the body and mind in obvious ways. This tested patience, discipline, and dignity. Every day he chose to stand there, to represent something larger than himself, to embody the history and tradition of the British military. A little girl approached with her mother, different from the mockers. She looked up at James with wide eyes full of wonder, not mockery. "Mummy, is he a real soldier?" she asked in a whisper. Her mother smiled gently. "Yes, sweetheart. He's very real and very brave." The girl considered this seriously. Then, with careful deliberation, she gave James a small, respectful salute. It was clumsy and unpracticed, but it was sincere. In that moment, James felt something shift. One person understood. One person saw past the costume and recognized the service. The morning continued with its mix of respect and ridicule, but that little girl's salute stayed with him. It reminded him why he stood there. Not for the mockers, not for the cameras, not for the tourists who would never understand. He stood there for the people who valued what he represented, for the traditions that connected current soldiers to centuries of service, for the brothers and sisters in arms who stood beside him, both present and fallen. As noon approached and the changing of the guard ceremony drew near, James prepared mentally for the choreographed ritual. His body remained still, but his mind was active, reviewing every step, every turn, every movement that would be executed with absolute precision. The tourists would watch and take their photos, and most would never realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. The sun climbed higher, warming the courtyard. Sweat began to form beneath James's heavy bearskin hat, but he didn't shift or show discomfort. A new group of tourists arrived, and the cycle of comments began again. Someone made a joke about wax figures. Someone else wondered aloud if the guards were allowed bathroom breaks. The laughter followed predictably. James Mitchell stood firm, unmoved, and unmoving, carrying the weight of his service, his scars, and his purpose with quiet dignity. The tourists would leave and forget him by dinner, But he would return tomorrow and the day after, standing guard not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Because some things were worth protecting, even if those you protected never understood the cost. The changing of the guard ceremony began precisely at noon, as it had every day for generations. James heard the distant sound of marching feet and the crisp commands echoing across the courtyard. His replacement was approaching, along with the rest of the relief guard. The tourists surged forward, cameras ready, excited to witness the famous ritual they had seen in countless photographs and videos. James remained at attention, his focus absolute. The precision required for this ceremony was extraordinary. Every step had to be exact, every movement synchronized, every gesture performed with the same attention to detail that his ancestors in uniform had given 100 years before. This wasn't just a show for tourists. This was a military operation. Executed with the same seriousness as any mission, the relief guard marched into position with perfect synchronization. Their boots struck the cobblestones in unified rhythm, creating a sound that resonated across the courtyard. The tourists fell quiet, captivated despite themselves by the display of discipline and coordination. Even the mockers from earlier paused their commentary. Drawn into the moment by the sheer spectacle of military precision, James executed his part flawlessly. Each movement practiced thousands of times until it became second nature. The inspection, the exchange of posts, the crisp salutes, everything happened exactly as it should. For those few minutes, the ceremony commanded respect even from those who had shown none before. After being relieved, James marched away with his unit, maintaining formation until they were out of public view. Only then did he allow his shoulders to relax slightly, feeling the strain of hours spent motionless finally release. His legs ached, his back was stiff, and the headache from wearing the heavy bearskin hat throbbed behind his eyes. But he had completed his duty. In the guardroom, James removed his ceremonial uniform with practiced efficiency. The other guards were doing the same, some chatting about their shifts, others quiet and tired. Most of them were combat veterans like him, men who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, or other deployments. They shared an unspoken understanding, a bond forged through shared experience. "Rough crowd today?" asked Marcus, another guard who had been stationed at a different post. He was younger than James, with only one deployment under his belt, but he carried himself with the same quiet professionalism. James shrugged as he hung up his red coat. "The usual. Lots of photo requests, lots of comments about us being statues or actors. One guy got pretty close, but security handled it." Marcus nodded knowingly. "Had a woman tell me I should get a real job. Said her son could do what I do while eating a sandwich." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Her son probably can't do 10 push-ups." An older guard named William joined the conversation. He had served for over 2 decades and had been with the Queen's Guard for 5 years. His face bore the weathered look of someone who had seen too much. "They never understand," he said quietly. "And maybe that's for the best. If they understood what we'd been through, what we'd seen, they might not sleep so well at night." The words hung in the air. James thought about the civilians he had protected during his deployments, people who would never know his name or his sacrifice. He thought about the children in Afghan villages who had waved at his unit during patrols, innocent and hopeful despite living in a war zone. He thought about the interpreters who had risked their lives to help, some of whom hadn't made it out when the withdrawal came. "My daughter asked me yesterday why I do this," William continued, his voice distant. "She's 8. She wanted to know why I wear the funny hat and let people take pictures. I tried to explain about duty and tradition, but how do you make an 8-year-old understand?" James finished changing into his regular uniform. "What did you tell her?" William smiled slightly. "I told her that some jobs are important even when they look silly. I told her that someone has to protect the things that matter, even the things we can't touch or hold. She said she thought I was very brave, and then she asked if we could get ice cream." The group chuckled at that, the tension breaking slightly. Children had a way of cutting through complexity with simple truth. William's daughter might not understand the details, but she understood pride and purpose. That was enough. James made his way to the canteen, grabbing a quick lunch before his afternoon duties. The base was busy with activity, soldiers going about their various tasks. Some were preparing for deployments, others were in training, and still others were handling administrative duties. The military never stopped, even when the public only saw the ceremonial surface. As he ate, James checked his phone. There were messages from his sister Emma asking how his day was going. She always worried about him ever since he had come home wounded from his last deployment. She had been at the hospital every day during his recovery, bringing magazines and terrible jokes to lift his spirits. She had held his hand through the nightmares and the dark moments. When he wondered if he would ever feel normal again, Emma was the only family James had left. Their parents had died in a car accident when he was 19, just months before his first deployment. The military had become his family after that, giving him structure and purpose when everything else had fallen apart. Emma had supported his choice to serve. Even though she worried constantly, he typed a quick response, assuring her he was fine and promising to call her after his shift. She would want details, would want to know that he was taking care of himself. She didn't understand the military life, but she tried, and that effort meant everything to him. The afternoon brought different duties. James was assigned to patrol the interior corridors, checking security points and ensuring everything was in order. This work was less visible but equally important. The pageantry that tourists saw was only one small part of what the Queen's Guard actually did. They were real soldiers with real responsibilities, protecting real people and real assets. As he walked the corridors, James passed by portraits of past monarchs and military leaders. Centuries of history looked down from those frames. Generations of men and women who had worn uniforms and stood guard over a nation. He was part of that continuum now. One more link in a chain that stretched back through time. His radio crackled with routine updates. Everything was normal, no incidents, no concerns. These quiet days were blessings, even if the tourists found them boring. James had seen enough excitement for one lifetime. The chaos of combat, the adrenaline spike of incoming fire, the terrible clarity that came with life-or-death decisions. He didn't miss any of it, but he missed his unit. He missed the men he had served with, the brothers forged in fire. Some of them were still deployed, still out there doing the dangerous work. Some had transitioned to civilian life, struggling to find their place in a world that didn't understand them. And some were gone, their names engraved on memorials, their sacrifices remembered but never truly comprehended by those who hadn't been there. James stopped at a window overlooking the courtyard. From this vantage point, he could see the new guards at their posts, standing still as statues while tourists milled about. He could see the flash of cameras, the pointing fingers, the casual disrespect of people who simply didn't know any better. A memory surfaced unbidden. Afghanistan, during his second tour. His unit had been providing security for a medical convoy delivering supplies to a remote village clinic. The local children had gathered around, curious and excited despite the presence of armed foreign soldiers. One little boy, maybe 6 years old, had approached James with a hesitant smile. The boy had pointed at James's rifle, then at his own chest, making a shooting gesture. But then he had shaken his head vigorously and pointed instead at a makeshift soccer ball, really just rags wrapped in tape. The message was clear. He wanted to play, not fight. He wanted to be a normal kid, not a child of war. James had knelt down and shown the boy a photo he carried of Emma. The boy had studied it seriously. Then pulled out his own treasure, a crumpled picture of his own family. In that moment, they weren't soldier and civilian, occupier and occupied. They were just two people sharing something human in the midst of inhumanity. The convoy had delivered its supplies and left. James never saw that boy again. He hoped the clinic had helped, hoped the village had found some measure of peace, hoped that boy got to play soccer instead of dodging bullets. But he would never know. That was the hardest part of military service, all the stories without endings. All the people you tried to help but couldn't follow up on. All the good intentions that disappeared into the chaos of conflict. His radio crackled again, pulling him back to the present. Another routine check-in, another confirmation that all was well. James responded with practiced efficiency, then continued his patrol. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. James checked in with various security points, reviewed access logs, and coordinated with other guards on shift. The work was methodical and necessary, far from glamorous but essential to the operation's success. This was real military work, the kind that happened behind the scenes while civilians enjoyed their peaceful lives, blissfully unaware of all the systems in place to keep them safe. As evening approached, James finished his duties and prepared to head home. He lived in a small flat not far from the base, a modest space that suited his simple needs. The walls were mostly bare except for a few photos Emma at her university. Graduation, his old unit gathered around an armored vehicle, his parents smiling at some long-ago family gathering. The commute home took him through busy London streets, crowds of people heading to dinner or shows or whatever entertainment awaited them. James moved through the masses anonymously, just another face in the crowd, the red uniform and bearskin hat left behind at the base. Nobody looked at him twice. Nobody knew who he was or what he had done. He preferred it that way. The attention at the palace was part of the job, something to be endured with dignity. But here, in the regular world, he could just be James Mitchell, a man trying to build a life after war, carrying his scars quietly and finding meaning in service. The next morning arrived with gray skies and a promise of rain. James completed his usual routine coffee, breakfast, reviewing the day's assignments before heading back to the palace. The weather meant fewer tourists, which would make the day easier in some ways but harder in others. The quiet gave more space for memories to intrude. He arrived at the guardroom early, as always. Punctuality had been drilled into him during basic training and reinforced through years of military service. Being late wasn't just disrespectful. It could be dangerous. In combat zones, timing meant the difference between life and death. Even here, in peaceful London, the habits remained. William was already there, polishing his boots to a mirror shine. The older guard looked tired, dark circles under his eyes suggesting another sleepless night. James had those nights too, when the past refused to stay buried and dreams became battlefields. "Morning," James offered, setting down his kit. William glanced up and nodded. "Morning. Heard you're on front gate duty again today?" James confirmed this with a grunt as he began preparing his uniform. The red coat had to be perfect, every button gleaming, every seam straight. The bearskin hat required careful handling, positioned just so. The attention to detail was obsessive, but that was the point. Excellence in small things built habits that carried through to larger challenges. Marcus arrived next, bringing with him the energy of youth and relative inexperience. He was chattering about a news story he had seen, something about celebrities visiting London. James listened with half an ear while focusing on his preparations. The ceremonial aspect required different mental preparation than combat, but preparation nonetheless. "Did you see that video going around?" Marcus asked, directing his question to the room in general. Someone filmed a guard at Windsor, and tourists were trying everything to make him react. One guy was doing handstands right in front of him. William shook his head in disapproval. "People have lost all sense of respect. Back when I started, tourists would actually keep a respectful distance. Now they treat us like attractions at a theme park." "The internet made it worse," James added, fastening his coat. "Everyone wants that viral moment, that clip that gets 1 million views. They don't think about the person underneath the uniform." Marcus considered this thoughtfully. "Do you ever want to just break character? Tell them what you've actually done, what you've been through?" James paused, reflecting on the question. "Sometimes, but what would be the point? They wouldn't believe it, or they wouldn't care. And even if they did, that's not what the duty is about. We don't stand there for recognition or appreciation. We stand there because it needs to be done." The conversation died down as they finished preparations. Soon, the commanding officer arrived for inspection, examining each guard with a critical eye that missed nothing. A crooked button, a scuff on a boot, any minor imperfection would be noted and corrected. This wasn't vanity, it was discipline. If you couldn't maintain standards in uniform, how could you be trusted to maintain them in more serious situations? James passed inspection without issue and marched out with his unit to take up positions. The rain had started, a light drizzle that would grow heavier as the day progressed. The tourists who had braved the weather huddled under umbrellas, still determined to get their photos despite the discomfort. Taking his position at the front gate, James settled into the familiar stillness. Rain ran down his face, soaking into his uniform, but he didn't flinch or wipe it away. Discomfort was temporary. Duty was constant. He had stood in blazing desert heat with full combat gear, had crouched in freezing mountain passes, had gone days without proper sleep during operations. Rain was nothing. The morning started slowly, fewer tourists than usual, but still a steady trickle. A Japanese couple approached first, very polite and respectful, asking permission before taking photos. James appreciated that, even though he couldn't acknowledge it. They snapped a few quick pictures and moved on without incident. Others were less considerate. A group of teenagers treated his post like a prop, leaning against the gate, making faces, testing boundaries. James remained impassive, his mind drifting to memories of patience learned through harder trials. During his first deployment, patience had been a survival skill. Waiting in observation posts for hours, scanning horizons for threats that might never come but couldn't be ignored. Maintaining vigilance when boredom threatened to dull alertness. Understanding that the absence of action didn't mean the absence of danger, he remembered one particular mission, a routine patrol that had stretched into an endurance test. His squad had been tasked with securing a supply route, which meant long hours of watching empty roads under merciless sun. Nothing had happened for 3 days. Soldiers grew restless, complaining about the pointless assignment. On the 4th day, their vigilance had paid off. James had spotted something off about a vehicle approaching in the distance, the way it sat low on its suspension, suggesting extra weight. He had called it in, and the vehicle had been stopped and searched. It was loaded with explosives, intended to ambush the next convoy. That patrol had saved lives, dozens of them, but nobody would ever know except his unit and the command staff. No medals were awarded for preventing attacks that never happened. No headlines celebrated threats that were neutralized before they could materialize. Just another day in an endless rotation of such days. Standing here in the rain, James understood that his current duty operated on the same principle. Deterrence through presence, security through vigilance, protection through commitment. The tourists laughed and took photos, unaware that his training, his experience, his readiness served a real purpose beyond spectacle. A television crew arrived. Mid-morning, setting up cameras to film a segment about London landmarks. The reporter, a polished woman in expensive clothes, positioned herself near James for her stand-up. She talked about British tradition and royal pageantry, describing the guards as living history, tourist attractions, symbols of a bygone era. James listened to her narration with internal irony. She called him a symbol as if he were merely decorative. She spoke about tradition as if it were separate from the living, breathing men who maintained it. She never mentioned that the guards were active duty soldiers, that many were combat veterans, that their service extended far beyond standing still for cameras. The reporter finished her segment and the crew began packing up. As they left, the reporter glanced back at James, really seeing him for perhaps the first time. Something in his face, some quality in his bearing, seemed to give her pause. For a moment, she looked uncertain, as if realizing she had missed something important in her story. But the moment passed, and she turned away. Already moving on to the next assignment, lunchtime brought a school group, children maybe 9 or 10 years old, accompanied by harried teachers trying to maintain order. The kids were excited and curious, pressing close to the gates, asking questions their teachers couldn't fully answer. One little boy, braver than the rest, stepped forward. "Sir, are you a real soldier?" the boy asked, his voice small but sincere. James, of course, couldn't answer. But one of the teachers, a middle-aged man who seemed more informed than most, knelt beside the boy. "Yes, he is. These guards are all real soldiers who have served their country in real wars. They've earned the right to stand here." The boy's eyes widened with new understanding. He stared at James with something like awe, suddenly seeing past the costume to the person underneath. "Thank you for your service," the boy said softly. Attempting a salute that was clumsy but heartfelt, James felt something tighten in his chest. Children understood honor instinctively, before cynicism and familiarity dulled their ability to recognize sacrifice. That boy would grow up and maybe forget this moment, or maybe he would remember and understand that the world was protected by people willing to stand in difficult places. The teacher herded the children along, but not before giving James a respectful nod. Small moments like these sustained him through the harder ones, the mockery and disrespect and willful ignorance. Not everyone was blind. Not everyone failed to see. The rain intensified through the afternoon, becoming a proper downpour. Most tourists retreated to cafes and museums, leaving the courtyard nearly empty. James stood in the deluge, water streaming off his bearskin hat, his uniform thoroughly soaked. The cold seeped through layers of fabric, but he maintained his position without complaint. This too was familiar. Afghanistan had been scorching during summer, but winter had brought cold that cut through gear and chilled bones. Mountain operations had exposed his unit to temperatures well below freezing, conditions where moisture became an enemy as dangerous as hostile forces. He had stood watch in that cold, had maintained readiness when his fingers barely worked and his breath froze in the air. This London rain was uncomfortable, but it was safe. Nobody was shooting at him. No IEDs waited beneath the cobblestones. No mortar rounds would suddenly scream down from the sky. Discomfort was a small price for that security, for the knowledge that he would walk away at the end of his shift, whole and alive. A single tourist remained in the courtyard, an elderly man with a sturdy umbrella and an expression of quiet respect. He stood at a respectful distance, not taking photos, just watching. After a long while, he approached slowly, carefully, and stood at attention himself for a moment. Then he saluted, a proper military salute, executed with the precision of someone who had served. The man held the salute for a long moment, then lowered his arm and walked away without a word. James understood. That had been communication between soldiers, recognition passing between men who had worn uniforms in defense of something larger than themselves. Words weren't necessary. The gesture said everything. As the afternoon waned and his relief approached, James reflected on the nature of service. It wasn't always glorious. It often wasn't appreciated. The public saw only surfaces, fancy uniforms, rigid protocols, traditions they didn't understand. They didn't see the years of training, the deployments endured, the prices paid, the reasons why someone would choose to stand in the rain and let strangers mock them. But service had never been about recognition. It had been about duty, about commitment, about being part of something that mattered. James had joined the military to serve his country, to protect people who would never know his name. That purpose hadn't changed when his duties shifted from combat to ceremony. He was still serving, still protecting, still standing watch over things worth defending. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded with the same precision despite the rain. His replacement arrived, the ritual exchanges were performed, and James marched away from his post. As he entered the guardroom and began removing his soaked uniform, he felt the satisfaction of another duty completed, another day of service rendered. William was already there, having been relieved earlier. He handed James a towel with a knowing smile. Proper British weather today. James dried his face and hair, the warmth of the guardroom slowly returning feeling to his cold-numbed skin. Nothing we haven't handled before. True enough, William agreed. Though I'd take a London downpour over Basra summer any day. They shared a tired laugh, the humor of men who had perspective earned through harder experiences. The day had been long and uncomfortable, but they had endured worse and would endure more. That was what soldiers did. They endured, they persevered. They stood their post regardless of conditions or comfort. 3 days later, James found himself assigned to a special detail. A state function was being held at the palace, hosting foreign dignitaries and military officials. The security requirements were heightened, and the ceremonial aspects were even more critical than usual. Every guard selected for this duty had been chosen for their exemplary records and proven reliability. The preparations began hours before the event. James and the other selected guards underwent additional briefings on protocols, routes, and contingency procedures. They reviewed floor plans, studied guest lists, and coordinated with other security services. This was the reality of their role, that tourists never saw real military planning for real security operations, as they prepared. James found himself working alongside guards he hadn't met before. Men from different regiments, all brought together for this assignment. They introduced themselves with the easy camaraderie of fellow soldiers, sharing brief stories about their backgrounds and deployments. One guard, Daniel, had served in Iraq during the height of the conflict. Another, Christopher, had been part of peacekeeping operations in the Balkans. A third, Raj, had completed multiple tours in Afghanistan, overlapping with one of James's own deployments. They compared experiences, finding common ground in shared hardships and mutual understanding. "Did you hear about the incident last week?" Daniel asked as they stood in formation, waiting for the ceremony to begin. A tourist got arrested for trying to climb the fence. Sighed, he wanted to prove the security was weak. Christopher shook his head. "People watch too many movies. They think this is all just for show, that real security is somewhere else. They don't realize we're the first line, and we're quite capable." Raj added quietly, "I had someone tell me last month that I must not be smart enough for a real job. Showed him my engineering degree on my phone. He didn't know what to say after that." James smiled at that. The assumption that ceremonial guards were somehow less capable or intelligent was common and completely wrong. Many guards held advanced degrees, had specialized military training, or spoke multiple languages. The selection process ensured only the best were chosen, and intelligence was very much part of the criteria. The state function began with the arrival of guests. James stood at his assigned position in a corridor that dignitaries would pass through. His role was both ceremonial and functional, presenting a formal military presence, while maintaining awareness of security concerns. His eyes tracked movement without appearing to, noted faces, watched for anything unusual. The foreign military officials who passed by recognized what they were seeing. Several offered subtle nods of acknowledgement, soldier to soldier. A general from a Commonwealth nation paused briefly, examining the guards with professional appreciation before moving on. These men understood military bearing and discipline when they saw it. During a quiet moment between arrivals, James's mind wandered back to a conversation he had with Emma last week. She had asked him, as she sometimes did, whether he ever regretted his military service. Whether the wounds, both physical and mental, had been worth it. He had struggled to answer in a way she would understand. How could he explain that despite everything, the pain, the trauma, the friends lost, the innocence destroyed, he would make the same choice again? The military had given him purpose when his parents died. It had taught him discipline, courage, and the meaning of true commitment. It had shown him both the worst and best of humanity. Yes, he carried scars. Yes, he had nightmares. Yes, there were moments when the weight of memory threatened to crush him. But he had also saved lives. He had stood between danger and innocence. He had been part of something meaningful, had served alongside people of extraordinary courage and character. That had value impossible to quantify. Emma had listened and tried to understand, though he could see the worry never left her eyes. She wanted him safe, wanted him whole, wanted him to be the carefree brother she remembered from before employment. But that person was gone, transformed by experience into someone different. Not necessarily worse, but changed in ways that couldn't be reversed. A commotion down the corridor pulled James back to the present. One of the dignitaries had stopped to speak with another guard, asking questions about the uniform and the tradition. The guard handled the interaction with practiced diplomacy, providing information while maintaining his formal bearing. It was a delicate balance, being both accessible and professional. The event continued for several hours, a carefully choreographed display of diplomatic pageantry. James maintained his position throughout, his legs aching from standing still, his shoulders tense from holding perfect posture. But the discomfort was minor compared to the satisfaction of executing his duty flawlessly. Near the end of the function, a decorated general from the United States approached James directly. The man had combat ribbons covering his dress uniform, marking a career of distinguished service. He studied James for a moment, then spoke quietly. Afghanistan? The general asked. James broke protocol slightly, meeting the man's eyes and offering a nearly imperceptible nod. The general could tell somehow, could read the signs that one soldier recognized in another. Perhaps it was something in James's bearing or the way his eyes tracked movement, or simply the indefinable quality that came from having seen combat. The general nodded back, understanding passing between them. Thank you for your service, soldier. Both then and now. He moved on without waiting for a response, leaving James with an unexpected surge of validation. Recognition from someone who truly understood meant more than 1,000 tourist photographs after the event concluded. The special detail was debriefed. The commanding officer praised their performance, noting that visiting military officials had specifically commented on the professionalism displayed by the guards. It was a small acknowledgement, unlikely to appear on any formal record, but it mattered to the men who had stood their posts perfectly for hours. In the guardroom afterward, the special detail relaxed together, the tension of formal duty releasing. They traded stories and jokes, building the bonds that formed between soldiers who had shared a task well done. James found himself genuinely enjoying the camaraderie, reminded of the squad dynamics he had missed since leaving active deployment. You know what I appreciate about this duty? Christopher said, addressing the group. It's predictable. No sudden explosions, no ambush, no having to make life or death decisions in split seconds. Just discipline and routine. Daniel disagreed mildly. True, but sometimes I miss the clarity of deployment. Everything was simpler there, in a way. The mission was clear, the enemy was obvious, and you knew exactly what you were fighting for. Raj nodded thoughtfully. Here, we're fighting ignorance and disrespect with silence and discipline. It's a different kind of battle, one that requires different weapons. Patience instead of firepower. Dignity instead of aggression. James considered their words. They were all right in different ways. This duty was both easier and harder than combat. Easier because the physical danger was minimal, harder because the challenges were psychological and emotional. Standing still while being mocked required a different kind of courage than charging into fire. Neither was superior to the other. They were simply different expressions of the same commitment to service. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: weekend plans, family updates, complaints about military bureaucracy. The normalcy was comforting, a reminder that they were still regular people beneath the uniforms and the trauma. They had lives outside of service, relationships to maintain, interests to pursue, futures to build. James left the palace that evening feeling more connected than he had in weeks. The special detail had reminded him that he was part of a larger community, that other men carried similar burdens and found similar meaning in service. The isolation that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him felt less absolute knowing others understood. He called Emma on his way home, catching her between classes at the university where she taught literature. She answered with her usual worried greeting, asking immediately if he was all right. James assured her he was fine, better than fine actually, and told her about the state function and the American general's recognition. Emma listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was trying to understand his world. She couldn't fully grasp it, would never truly know what he had experienced, but she tried, and that effort bridged the gap between them. They talked for 20 minutes, discussing her students, his duties, their plans to meet for dinner that weekend. After hanging up, James continued his commute with a lighter heart. Emma's concern sometimes felt suffocating, but it came from love and he couldn't fault her for that. She had already lost their parents. Of course she feared losing him too. His service had put her through years of worry, and he owed her patience and reassurance even when he didn't feel like providing it. Back at his flat, James made a simple dinner and settled in for the evening. He had learned to appreciate quiet nights, to find peace in solitude rather than feeling threatened by it. The adjustment to civilian life, even the structured military life of ceremonial duty, had been difficult. Combat created a dix of adrenaline and clarity. Coming down from that high took time and deliberate effort. He had attended therapy sessions at the military hospital, talking through the trauma with professionals who specialized in combat stress. The sessions helped, though progress came slowly and inconsistently. Some days he felt normal, integrated, capable of moving forward. Other days the past crashed over him like a wave, drowning present reality in old memories. Tonight was a good night. The validation from the general, the camaraderie with fellow guards, the successful completion of important duty, these things formed a foundation of positive experience to build on. James recognized and appreciated these moments, knowing harder ones would inevitably come. He spent the evening reading, losing himself in a novel about mountain climbing, enjoying the adventure while sitting safely in his comfortable chair. The simple pleasure of reading for enjoyment rather than for intelligence briefings or tactical manuals was something he had rediscovered with gratitude. Small joys mattered, perhaps more than large ones because they came without cost or consequence. Before bed, James stood at his window looking out over London's lights. Millions of people going about their lives, most of them never thinking about the men and women who stood watch, who served in uniform, who carried the weight of protection so others could sleep peacefully. That anonymity was fine. He didn't need recognition or thanks. He needed purpose, and he had found it again in this unexpected role. Tomorrow would bring new tourists, new mockery, new tests of patience and discipline. But it would also bring another opportunity to serve, another day of meaning, another small contribution to something larger than himself. James Mitchell had learned through fire and hardship that this was enough. That this mattered, that the duty itself was the reward, a week after the state function. James arrived for his shift to find an unusual atmosphere in the guardroom. The other guards were clustered around a laptop, watching something intently. As he approached, Marcus looked up with a complicated expression mixing anger and resignation. "You need to see this," Marcus said. Turning the screen toward James. It was a video posted on social media, already viral with millions of views. The footage showed several tourists at the palace, progressively escalating their harassment of a guard at his post. They made crude jokes, performed mocking dances, and eventually one person got close, enough to tap the guard on the shoulder while another filmed his reaction. The guard in the video was William. James could see the older man's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the only sign of his internal struggle. But William had maintained his composure, and eventually security had intervened. The video ended with the tourists laughing as they were escorted away. Treating the whole incident as entertainment. The comments section was even worse. Thousands of people had weighed in, most mocking the guards as overpaid statues, questioning why they were needed in modern times, suggesting they were just plain dress-up for tourists. A few comments defended the guards, but they were drowned out by mockery and ignorance. "It happened yesterday," Marcus explained. William filed a report, and those tourists are now banned from royal properties. But the video is everywhere. My own sister sent it to me asking why we let people treat us like that. James watched the video again, feeling a familiar frustration. This was the reality of their duty in the age of social media. One incident, one moment of harassment, could be broadcast to the world and turned into entertainment. The dignity and discipline William had shown meant nothing to viewers who saw only a funny video. "How is William handling it?" James asked. "He called in sick today," another guard answered. "First time he's missed a shift in 3 years. I think this one got to him." The mood in the guardroom was somber as they prepared for duty. Every guard knew they might be next, that any shift could result in being the subject of viral mockery. It was an occupational hazard they accepted, but that didn't make it easier to endure. James took his position at the front gate with the video still playing in his mind. He understood William's struggle intimately. It was one thing to face disrespect in person, to let it wash over you and dissipate. It was another to have that disrespect captured, amplified, and shared millions of times. The internet had given cruelty a permanent record and unlimited audience. The morning started quietly, but James could feel eyes on him differently now. Several tourists approached with their phones already recording, clearly hoping to create the next viral moment. One young man came uncomfortably close, talking loudly about the video he had seen and wondering if he could get similar footage. "Come on, mate, just give us a little smile," the man said. waving his hand in front of James's face. "Everyone wants to see you guys crack. What's the harm in having a bit of fun?" James remained motionless, his training and discipline holding firm. But inside, he felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. These people had no idea what they were doing, no concept of the disrespect they were showing. They saw entertainment where there should have been reverence, comedy where there should have been respect. The man's friend joined in, both of them now trying various tactics to provoke a reaction. They made faces, told jokes, speculated loudly about what would happen if they actually touched him. Security was approaching, but slowly, giving James the chance to handle it according to protocol. For a moment, James allowed himself to imagine breaking position. He imagined turning to these tourists and telling them exactly what he thought, where he had been, what he had done. He imagined describing the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, the reasons why his service mattered beyond their comprehension. He imagined their faces as they realized they had been mocking a decorated combat veteran. Too. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. He maintained the discipline that defined his role. Because breaking position wouldn't educate these tourists, it would only prove them right. They wanted a reaction, wanted to feel powerful by making a soldier lose control, denying them that satisfaction was the only real victory available. Security finally intervened, firmly asking the men to step back. They complied with exaggerated innocence, filming everything for their own social media accounts. As they walked away, James heard one say to the other, "That was epic. Gonna get so many views." The incident left James feeling drained. It was barely noon and already he felt exhausted by the constant effort of maintaining composure. He thought about William, about how many similar incidents the older guard had endured over the years before finally reaching his breaking point. Everyone had limits, even the most disciplined soldiers. During a brief moment when tourist traffic was light, another guard approached for a formal inspection. But instead of simply checking uniform details, he paused and spoke quietly. "Rough morning?" James gave the slightest nod, the minimal acknowledgement that was permissible. "William's video sparked something," the guard continued, still pretending to inspect. "Command is discussing new protocols for handling harassment. Your patience today is noted and appreciated." The guard moved on, but his words provided unexpected support. James wasn't alone in this. His command understood the challenges, valued the restraint, recognized that what looked like passive standing actually required active strength. The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor. An elderly woman approached slowly, using a cane for support. She positioned herself at a respectful distance and simply stood there, watching James with intense focus. After several minutes, she carefully lowered herself onto a nearby bench and continued watching. This went on for over an hour. The woman never took photos, never made comments, just observed with quiet attention. Other tourists came and went, but she remained, a silent presence that James found oddly comforting. There was respect in her stillness, recognition in her patience. Finally, as she prepared to leave, the woman stood with difficulty and approached as close as the barriers allowed. She looked directly at James, and he could see tears in her eyes. "My husband was a guardsman," she said softly. 50 years ago, he stood where you stand now. He served in Korea before that. He never talked much about the war, but he always said his time with the Guard was the proudest of his life." She paused, composing herself. "He passed away last year. I came here today because I wanted to feel close to him again. Watching you stand there with such dignity, such strength, it reminded me of everything he was. Thank you for honoring his memory by continuing the tradition." The woman placed her hand over her heart in a gesture of profound respect, then turned and walked away. James felt something crack in his carefully maintained composure, not breaking but shifting. This woman understood. She had loved a man who had stood where James stood, who had served with similar commitment. Her gratitude and recognition meant more than any medal or commendation ever could. The rest of the shift passed in reflection. James thought about the guardsmen who had stood at this post 50 years before, about the continuity of service stretching back through generations. He thought about all the men who had worn this uniform, who had faced their own versions of mockery and disrespect, who had maintained discipline through changing times and evolving challenges. He thought about the battles that had been fought to protect the tradition he now represented. Not just military battles, though those too, but the daily battle against cynicism and disrespect. Every guard who maintained composure in the face of harassment fought that battle. Every soldier who stood firm while being treated as a tourist attraction defended something valuable. When his relief arrived and the changing of the guard ceremony began, James performed his part with renewed commitment. The precision of the movements, the coordination of the unit, the flawless execution of tradition, these things mattered. They connected past to present, honored those who had served before, and established a foundation for those who would serve after. In the guardroom afterward, James found William had returned. The older guard looked tired but determined, ready to reclaim his place despite the viral humiliation. The other guards greeted him with quiet support. No jokes about the video, no awkward questions. Just the solid presence of brothers in arms, understanding and solidarity without need for words. "I almost didn't come back," William admitted as they changed out of their ceremonial uniforms. "My wife said I should request a transfer, that I shouldn't have to put up with that treatment. But then I realized that's exactly what they want. They want us to give up, to stop standing our posts, to abandon the tradition because it's hard." He looked around at the assembled guards. "We've all faced worse than mockery. We've stood in places where people wanted to kill us, not just embarrass us. If we can survive that, we can survive anything, including the internet." The guards murmured agreement. William's words resonated because they came from experience and genuine struggle. He wasn't minimizing the difficulty or pretending the harassment didn't hurt. He was acknowledging it and choosing to persevere anyway, which was the essence of courage. James spoke up, surprising himself. "I had a woman visit today. Her husband was a guard decades ago, served in Korea. She said watching us reminded her of him, of his pride in the duty. I think we forget sometimes that we're not just standing here for tradition. We're standing here for people like her, people who remember and understand and value what this represents." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather was military. He died before I enlisted, but my grandmother always says he would have been proud. She doesn't understand everything about what we do, but she understands service. That's what matters." The conversation continued, each guard sharing their own connections to the tradition, their own reasons for enduring the difficult aspects of the duty. Family members who had served, historical moments that had inspired them, personal values that aligned with military principles. The thread that connected them all was commitment to something larger than individual comfort or recognition. Before leaving, James stopped by William's locker. "I'm glad you came back." William smiled tiredly. "Where else would I go? This is who I am now. 20 years of service, 5 years here. You can't just walk away from that. The uniform becomes part of you, for better or worse." James understood completely. The military had shaped him in ways that couldn't be undone. Even if he wanted to leave, and he didn't, part of him would always be a soldier. The discipline, the commitment, the willingness to stand in hard places, these weren't just job skills. They were identity. Walking home that evening, James felt the weight of the day settling into his bones. Physical tiredness from standing still, mental exhaustion from maintaining discipline, emotional drain from confronting disrespect and remembering why he endured it. But underneath all that was satisfaction, a sense of purpose fulfilled, duty rendered, contribution made. His phone rang, Emma checking in as she always did. He answered and listened to her news about faculty meetings and difficult students, the normalcy of her concerns providing welcome contrast to his day. When she asked about his shift, he mentioned the elderly woman but not the viral video or the harassment. Emma worried enough already. "I'm proud of you," Emma said suddenly. "I know I don't say it enough. I worry about you constantly, but I'm also incredibly proud that you've dedicated your life to serving others." "Dad would be proud too." James felt unexpected emotion tighten his throat. Emma rarely mentioned their parents, the loss still too painful even years later. "Thank you," he managed. "That means a lot." After they said goodbye, James stood outside his flat for a moment, looking up at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, soldiers were deployed in dangerous places. Others were training for future deployments. Still others were transitioning home, struggling to find purpose after combat. And here in London, guards stood their posts, maintaining tradition and discipline while tourists laughed. All of it was service. All of it mattered. And James Mitchell was exactly where he needed to be. 2 weeks after the viral video incident, James received an unexpected summons to the commanding officer's office. Such meetings were rare unless there was a problem or a special assignment. He arrived precisely on time, uniform perfect, uncertain what to expect. Colonel Harrison was a career military man, respected and fair, with 30 years of service and a reputation for understanding his soldiers. He gestured for James to sit, an informal signal that put James somewhat at ease. "At ease, Mitchell," the colonel said. "This isn't a disciplinary matter. In fact, it's quite the opposite." The colonel explained that there had been discussions at higher levels about public perception of the Queen's Guard. The viral video of William had sparked a broader conversation about how to bridge the gap between ceremonial tradition and public understanding. Someone had suggested having guards available for educational interactions, opportunities to help tourists understand what they were actually seeing. "We're planning a pilot program," Colonel Harrison continued. "Select guards will be available at scheduled times to answer questions, provide information about the role and the selection process. Nothing that compromises security or tradition, but enough to educate people who are genuinely interested." James listened with mixed feelings. Part of him appreciated the effort to combat ignorance. Another part worried about opening themselves up to more mockery or exploitation. "You've been recommended for the program, Mitchell. Your record is exemplary, you have combat experience that lends credibility, and multiple guards have mentioned your ability to remain composed under difficult circumstances. I think you'd represent us well." It wasn't really a request, though the colonel phrased it as one. James accepted, understanding that this was an opportunity to contribute differently, to perhaps help some tourists see beyond the costume to the person and the purpose underneath. The first session was scheduled for the following Saturday, a high-traffic day when tourist numbers would be substantial. James arrived early to review the guidelines and prepare mentally. He would spend an hour at a designated area, still in uniform, but in a more relaxed posture, available to answer appropriate questions. A sign explained the opportunity in multiple languages, inviting tourists to learn about the Queen's Guard from an active member. James positioned himself at the designated spot, feeling oddly vulnerable without the armor of stillness and silence. Speaking, engaging, making himself accessible, it went against all his ceremonial training. The first to approach was a middle-aged couple from Canada. They were polite and genuinely curious, asking thoughtful questions about the selection process and training requirements. James answered carefully, providing information while maintaining professional boundaries. They thanked him sincerely and moved on, seemingly satisfied with the exchange. Others followed throughout the hour. A family from Germany wanted to know about the bearskin hats and the history of the uniform. A group of Australian students asked about the daily routine and whether guards actually provided security or were purely decorative. James answered each question with patience, finding his rhythm, discovering that he could engage without compromising dignity. But not everyone came with good intentions. A group of young men approached with barely concealed smirks, their questions designed to mock rather than learn. "So what do you actually do besides stand around?" one asked with false innocence. Could you even handle real combat, or is this just for soldiers who can't cut it?" James met the young man's eyes steadily. This was the moment he had both anticipated and dreaded. He could deflect, could give a diplomatic non-answer, or he could offer truth and hope it penetrated the cynicism. "I've completed 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan," James said calmly. "I've been awarded commendations for actions under fire. I've pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles. I've made decisions that saved lives and decisions that still haunt me. This role isn't for soldiers who can't cut it. It's for soldiers who've proven they can." The young man's smirk faltered. His friends shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had misjudged the situation. One of them, looking genuinely chastened, asked quietly, "What made you want to do this after combat?" James considered the question carefully. "Combat takes something from you. It also gives you something perspective about what matters. Standing here, representing centuries of military tradition, honoring those who served before me, it's a different kind of service, but it's still service. Still worth doing." The group dispersed quietly, their mockery deflated by confrontation with reality. James watched them go, uncertain whether the interaction had changed anything. But at least they had heard, had been given the opportunity to understand even if they chose not to. An elderly man approached next, moving slowly with the careful deliberation of someone managing old injuries. He stood before James and studied him with sharp, assessing eyes. "You've seen action?" the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Afghanistan?" "3 tours," the man nodded slowly. "Vietnam?" "2 tours." "Medical discharge in 72, he gestured at James's uniform. "Never did ceremonial duty myself, but I always respected it. Takes discipline of a different kind." "Thank you, sir." "Your service is appreciated," the veteran smiled slightly. "Mine was a long time ago, yours is now. You're the one standing the post, carrying the burden. I just wanted to say I see you. Not the uniform, not the hat you." The soldier underneath. "Stay strong, young man." The encounter left James deeply moved. Recognition from fellow veterans always carried special weight, an acknowledgement that transcended words. This man had stood in his own hard places, had carried his own burdens, and he understood the cost of service in ways civilians never could. The hour concluded with a mixture of interactions, some enlightening, some frustrating, some forgettable. James returned to the guardroom feeling cautiously optimistic. The program had value, even if it only reached a small percentage of tourists. Seeds of understanding, once planted, might grow in unexpected ways. In the following weeks, James participated in several more educational sessions. Each one brought new questions, new challenges, new opportunities to bridge the gap between perception and reality. Some tourists remained dismissive or mocking, but others showed genuine interest and respect. The balance was slowly shifting, one conversation at a time. During one session, a teacher brought her entire class, having coordinated with the palace staff in advance. 20 teenagers stood before James, fidgeting with the restless energy of youth, but mostly attentive. The teacher had prepared them, explaining that they would have the chance to learn from an actual soldier. James spent 45 minutes with that group, answering questions that ranged from practical to philosophical. What does it feel like to be shot at? How do you stay still for so long? Why did you join the military? What's the hardest part of your job? Do you ever get scared? He answered honestly, appropriately for their age, trying to convey both the reality and the purpose of military service. He talked about duty and discipline, about courage being fear managed rather than fear absent, about finding meaning in service to something larger than oneself. One girl raised her hand tentatively. "My dad says soldiers are just following orders, that there's nothing special about it." "Is that true?" James chose his words carefully. "Following orders is part of being a soldier, but it's not everything. We're trained to think, to make decisions, to take initiative when needed. The best soldiers aren't robots, they're people who've learned to balance individual judgment with collective discipline. And choosing to serve in the first place, choosing to put yourself in harm's way for your country, that's a decision nobody forces on you." The teacher thanked him profusely afterward, saying several students had expressed interest in military careers, and all of them had gained new respect for what they had previously dismissed as mere pageantry. James felt the interaction had been worthwhile, that perhaps he had influenced how at least some young people would think about service and tradition. But the positive experiences were balanced by continued challenges. The viral video culture persisted, with tourists constantly trying to create the next shocking moment. Guards were still harassed, still mocked, still treated as entertainment rather than professionals. The educational program helped, but it was a small remedy for a large problem, one particularly difficult day. James was on regular duty when a group of drunk tourists approached. They were belligerent and disrespectful, clearly looking for trouble. Despite security warnings, they continued to harass James, making crude gestures and offensive comments. The situation escalated until security had to physically remove them. The incident left James shaken, angry in a way he hadn't been in months. Back in the guardroom, he struggled to compose himself, the frustration and indignity overwhelming his usual control. Marcus found him there, recognizing the signs of someone approaching their limit. "Talk to me," Marcus said simply. James explained the incident. The accumulated weight of countless similar moments, the exhaustion of maintaining dignity in the face of persistent disrespect. "I knew what I was signing up for," he said. "But knowing and living it are different things. Sometimes I wonder if this is sustainable, if I can keep doing this day after day." 6 months into his posting with the Queen's Guard, James Mitchell stood at his post on a crisp autumn morning. The leaves in the palace gardens had turned brilliant shades of gold and red, and the air carried the first hint of coming winter. Tourists bundled in light jackets milled about, their breath visible in the cool air, cameras ready as always. But something had shifted in those 6 months. James stood with the same discipline and precision, but the internal struggle had evolved. He had found a rhythm, a way to exist within the role that honored both the tradition and his own humanity. The mockery still came, the disrespect still stung, but he had developed the emotional armor necessary to weather it without being destroyed by it. A group approached teenagers with smartphones, already laughing before they even reached him. James recognized the setup, had seen it hundreds of times. They would try to make him react, would film everything, would post it online regardless of whether they succeeded. This was routine now, predictable as the changing of the guard. "Bet you 10 quid I can make him blink?" one boy said loudly to his friends. They gathered around, performing their familiar dance of provocation. Silly faces, waving hands, inappropriate comments. James remained still as stone, his mind calm, his breathing steady. This was just noise, just temporary irritation that would pass like weather. None of it touched the core of who he was or why he stood there. After several minutes of failure, the teenagers grew bored and wandered off, already forgetting the guard they had tried so hard to disturb. James watched them go without emotion, neither angry nor triumphant. They were just people passing through his day, as insignificant to his purpose as clouds passing overhead. An older couple approached next, their demeanor entirely different. They studied James with respectful interest, taking a few photos but maintaining proper distance. The woman leaned toward her husband and said something quietly, gesturing at James's uniform. The husband nodded and they moved closer, the man clearing his throat politely. "Excuse me, soldier," the man said. "We don't mean to disturb your duty, but I wanted my wife to see a real Queen's Guard up close. I served myself many years ago. Different regiment, but the same commitment. Just wanted to say thank you for maintaining the tradition." James, of course, couldn't respond verbally, but he allowed his eyes to briefly meet the man's, a moment of connection that acknowledged and appreciated the sentiment. The man nodded, understanding conveyed without words, and guided his wife away with gentle respect. These moments sustained James through the difficult ones. For every group of mockers there were individuals who understood, who recognized what he represented, who valued the service even if they couldn't fully comprehend its cost. The balance wasn't equal, but the meaningful connections outweighed the meaningless harassment. During a quiet period between tourist waves, James's mind drifted to a letter he had received last week. It was from a soldier in his old unit, still deployed in Afghanistan. The letter described current operations, the ongoing challenges, the evolution of the mission. But it also mentioned how the unit remembered James, how his actions were still talked about, how his example continued to inspire soldiers who had never met him. Reading that letter had stirred complex emotions. Pride, certainly, but also survivor's guilt and a strange sense of loss. Part of James would always be back there with his brothers in arms, facing danger together, bound by shared purpose. His current duty was important, but it was different in ways that sometimes left him feeling disconnected from the life he had known. Yet he was building something new here. The relationships with fellow guards, the routine of ceremonial duty, the satisfaction of maintaining standards under difficult conditions. These things were forming a new identity that existed alongside but separate from his combat veteran self. He was learning to be both people, to honor his past while living fully in his present. A school tour arrived mid-morning. A group of children, maybe 7 or 8 years old, shepherded by harried teachers. The children were excited and curious, pressing close to the barriers, chattering with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of youth. One little girl with pigtails stared at James with enormous eyes. "Is he real?" she asked her teacher in a stage whisper. The teacher smiled. "Very real. He's a soldier who protects important places and people, like a superhero?" the girl asked. "Yes, something like that. But real superheroes who train very hard and serve their country." The girl considered this seriously, then carefully raised her small hand in a salute. It was clumsy and imperfect, but James felt his chest tighten with emotion. Children understood honor before cynicism taught them otherwise. To this little girl, he was someone worthy of respect, someone heroic. That innocent perception mattered more than 1,000 viral videos. The morning progressed through its familiar patterns. Groups came and went, some respectful, others not. James maintained his post with the same unwavering discipline, a constant in the swirling chaos of tourist activity. His legs ached from standing still, his shoulders were sore from holding position, but these discomforts were minor and manageable. Around noon, something unexpected happened. A man in his 30s approached with a young boy, maybe 10 years old. The man was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he stood before James. The boy looked confused and uncomfortable, uncertain how to handle his father's emotional display. The man struggled to compose himself enough to speak. "I'm sorry," he managed. My brother was a soldier. He died in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Seeing you standing here, in uniform, with such dignity, it reminds me of him. Of why he served. Of everything we lost." James felt his own eyes sting with unexpected tears, though he blinked them back, maintaining his composure. This man's grief was raw and real, his loss profound. The brother he mourned might have been someone James served with, might have stood in the same places, might have shared the same experiences. The man's son tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, we should go. You're making a scene." But the man shook his head, looking directly at James. "Thank you," he said with fierce intensity. "Thank you for continuing to serve. Thank you for honoring the tradition my brother died protecting. Thank you for standing there despite everything, despite the way people treat you, despite how hard it must be. You're keeping his memory alive just by being here." The man finally allowed his son to lead him away, still crying, still overcome by emotion. James stood motionless, but inside he was shaken to his core. That man's brother had paid the ultimate price. James had been lucky enough to survive, to continue serving in a different capacity. The responsibility of that luck, the debt owed to those who hadn't made it home, pressed heavily on his shoulders. William appeared during the changing of the guard ceremony, executing his part of the ritual with flawless precision. The older guard had returned from the viral video incident stronger, more determined, refusing to let ignorant mockery drive him from duty. His resilience inspired James and the other guards, a living example of perseverance through difficulty. After being relieved, James joined William in the guardroom. They changed out of their ceremonial uniforms in comfortable silence, the camaraderie of shared experience requiring no words. But eventually William spoke. "You heard about Marcus?" he asked. James shook his head. "What happened?" "He requested a transfer, going back to active deployment. Said he couldn't handle the ceremonial duty anymore, needed to be doing something that felt more meaningful to him." James absorbed this news with mixed feelings. He understood Marcus's decision, respected it even. Not everyone could find meaning in this particular form of service. Some soldiers needed the clarity and purpose of active operations, the unambiguous nature of combat deployment. There was no shame in recognizing that and choosing accordingly. "How long are you planning to stay?" James asked William. The older guard smiled slightly. "Until they force me out or I physically can't do it anymore. This is my last posting before retirement. I want to finish strong, go out on my own terms." 5 more years, maybe, then I'll hang up the uniform for good. What will you do then? William shrugged. No idea. Military is all I've known for 25 years. Civilian life seems foreign and complicated, but I'll figure it out. We always do, don't we? Adapt and overcome. The phrase resonated with James, adapt and overcome, the unofficial motto of soldiers everywhere. The principle that had carried him through combat and continued to carry him through this different challenge. Life kept changing, kept presenting new obstacles, and the only option was to adjust and persevere. That evening, James attended a support group for combat veterans. He had been going weekly for the past 3 months, finding value in talking with people who understood the unique challenges of transitioning from war to peace. The group included veterans from various conflicts and branches of service, all struggling with their own versions of the same fundamental question: how do you live a meaningful life after experiencing the extremes of combat? During that night's session, James found himself talking about the man who had cried at his post, about the weight of survivor's guilt, about the challenge of honoring those who had fallen while building a life worth living. The group listened without judgment, offering their own perspectives and experiences. One veteran, a woman who had served in Iraq, spoke about finding purpose in civilian work, helping other veterans access services. Another talked about his struggle with meaninglessness, how nothing in civilian life seemed to matter after watching friends die. A third described slowly rebuilding connection to joy, learning to appreciate small pleasures that had seemed frivolous compared to the intensity of combat. The group facilitator, himself a Vietnam veteran, guided the conversation with practiced skill. Survival isn't betrayal, he said firmly. Living well isn't dishonoring the dead. They would want you to build good lives, to find meaning, to contribute however you can. The best way to honor their sacrifice is to make your continued existence valuable. The words were ones James had heard before, but they resonated differently this time. He thought about the little girl's salute, the veteran's acknowledgement, the grieving brother's gratitude. These moments were valuable. His current service was valuable. Living fully and serving faithfully honored the fallen far, more than wallowing in guilt or limiting himself out of misplaced loyalty to the past. Walking home after the session, James felt lighter than he had in months. The burden of survival guilt hadn't disappeared, would never fully disappear, but it had shifted into something more manageable. He could carry it without being crushed by it, could acknowledge it without being defined by it. Back at his flat, James pulled out a box he kept in his closet. It contained his deployment photos, patches from his old unit, letters from fellow soldiers, awards he had received but never displayed. He sorted through the memories carefully, allowing himself to feel the full weight of what he had experienced without shying away from difficult emotions. There were photos of men who hadn't made it home, smiling faces frozen in time before they had known what fate awaited them. James touched each photo, speaking their names aloud, ensuring they weren't forgotten. This was his responsibility as a survivor, to remember, to carry their stories, to live in a way that justified the chance they had been denied. He found a photo of his entire platoon, taken shortly before a major operation. Dirty, tired, but grinning with the dark humor that sustained soldiers through impossible situations. James was in the second row, looking impossibly young despite everything he had already experienced. Looking at that photo now, he barely recognized himself. That version of James Mitchell had existed, but he was gone, transformed by subsequent experience into someone different. The current James was still a soldier, still committed to service, but expressed that commitment differently. He stood at a palace gate instead of a firebase perimeter. He faced mockery instead of mortar. He protected tradition instead of convoys. All of it was valid. All of it mattered. His phone buzzed, a message from Emma, just checking in as she did most evenings. James smiled and replied with genuine warmth, assuring her he was fine, telling her about the little girl's salute but not mentioning the man who had cried. Emma carried enough worry already. She didn't need additional burdens. Before bed, James stood at his window and looked out over London's lights. Somewhere in the city, other guards were sleeping, preparing for their own shifts tomorrow. Somewhere further away, British soldiers maintained watch in dangerous places. And here, in this flat, James Mitchell prepared to return to his post, to stand guard with dignity and discipline, to serve however he was called to serve. The mockery would come again tomorrow. The disrespect would continue. Tourists would laugh and take photos and never understand what they were actually seeing. But James would stand firm, unmoved, and unmoving, carrying the weight of his past and the responsibility of his present with quiet dignity, because this was what soldiers did. They stood in difficult places. They endured what needed to be endured. They served not for recognition or appreciation, but because the duty itself had value. James Mitchell had learned this lesson in the deserts of Afghanistan, and he lived it every day at Buckingham Palace. As he prepared for sleep, James thought about the journey that had brought him here, the pain of losing his parents, the crucible of combat, the struggle of recovery, the unexpected honor of ceremonial duty. All of it had shaped him, had forged him into who he was now, a man who could stand still while the world swirled around him. Who could maintain dignity in the face of disrespect? Who could find meaning in service regardless of whether anyone else understood? Tomorrow he would return to his post. Tomorrow he would stand guard. Tomorrow tourists would mock and veterans would salute and children would stare with wonder. And through it all, James Mitchell would remain exactly what he had always been, a soldier, serving faithfully, standing watch over things worth protecting, honoring the tradition and the sacrifice and the commitment that connected him to generations of warriors who had come before and would come after. The rookie guard they had mocked was not a rookie in any way that mattered. He was a seasoned warrior who had chosen to serve in a different capacity, a survivor who honored the fallen through continued dedication, a man who understood that the hardest battles were sometimes fought in the quietest ways. And he would continue to stand, day after day, as long as duty required, unmoved by mockery, unbroken by difficulty, sustained by purpose and pride and the unwavering belief that his service, however it manifested, had value that transcended public understanding or appreciation. This was his story. This was his choice. This was his honor. And no amount of tourist laughter could diminish what he represented or why he stood there, protecting not just palaces but principles, not just tradition but truth, not just history but hope that some things would always be worth defending, no matter the cost.